Hey everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, with the breaking open of the USAID story, we're seeing a lot of people focusing on the places that federal aid is going. What is it supporting? What kind of programs is it pushing? What kind of agenda is it installing into these organizations? And an extra focus has really been the role that unfortunately many Christian denominations have played in the United States in facilitating mass migration. This often is really out of step with the parishioners, the people who actually go to the church, and tends to be a focus of different bureaucrats, managers, and leaders inside these organizations. Unfortunately, the Southern Baptist Conference is not entirely immune to this, and that's what I wanted to talk about today. Joining me is Jon Harris. He's an author, he's the host of Conversations That Matter, and he's also a filmmaker. Jon, thank you for joining me.
Thanks, Auron. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. You had a good piece in The Federalist touching on this topic, and there have been many people like Megan Basham and others who are documenting what's going on there, but specifically you focused on the SBC. Now, a lot of people may not be familiar with the different dynamics at play. For those who don't know, what is the importance of the Southern Baptist Coalition?
Yeah, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest Protestant denomination in the United States. And because of that, a lot of the books that are marketed to Christians are going to have to appeal to Southern Baptists. A lot of the conferences that happened in the greater Christian evangelical world are going to have to appeal to Southern Baptists. Southern Baptists have enough numbers to also make a major policy difference, not just with their vote, but also with their lobbying. And because of all of this, they are a bellwether for the direction of evangelical Christianity, which, of course, is a primary base of the Republican Party and the conservative movement.
And the SBC has a reputation as being one of the more based, as the kids say, denominations, right? Again, nothing's perfect, but out of those that are active and dominant in the United States, it tends to be the one that makes the leftists most angry, right? It's the lone bulwark, some might say, in a lot of moral situations. And so that's another reason that its influence is so critical.
That's right. Yeah, I think they were probably primary in that 81 or 82% who voted for Donald Trump. A lot of those were Southern Baptists. They primarily exist in the Southern United States, as the name implies. So when you look at deep red states, a lot of them are dominated by Southern Baptist churches. So, of course, they're where they live, who they are, and some of their doctrinal issues make them targets. For example, they prohibit or they narrow the range of the pastoral office to men. But even that is cracking a little bit. Last year at the convention, that issue became a point of debate, and it's a little uncertain what's going to happen in the future with that. They didn't want the Credentials Committee to strip churches who of their affiliation with the SBC if they had women pastors. So I bring that up only as an example, not to talk about that issue in depth, but because historically and presumably even still, that is one of the requirements. It's in the Baptist Faith and Message that this office is for men. Of course, that's out of step with the liberal order.
And I think that's really important because, and we'll get into this, I'm sure, in a bit once we touch on the rest of the subjects, there seems to be an institutional momentum effect happening in a lot of church denominations where it looks like leftism, rabid progressivism, wokeness, if you will, is licking its wounds. If it hasn't been entirely defeated, it is certainly retreating to a different position at this point. But it seems like many of the churches are doubling down on this simultaneously. I don't even know if this is still accurate, but, they used to tell us that the dinosaurs, you'd have one thing hit their tail because it's so long, it'd take, a minute or two for it to actually get to the other side of the brontosaurus. It feels like that a lot of these churches are that kind of dinosaur where, the elite signaling was leftist for so long that it took them a while, but they finally started picking it up and signaling progressively. And now that the elite signaling has switched and seems to be heading more rightward, they're still pushing the leftism. The signal is still trying to go from the tail to the head. And so Interesting that, as you point out in the piece, such a high percentage of Southern Baptist churchgoers are going to be Trump supporters, are going to believe in things like strict border control, and yet that's not reflected in any serious way in a lot of the leadership of these denominations.
No, it's not. And there was actually a Southern Baptist poll. I did not include this in the article because it would have been too long, but Lifeway, which is a Southern Baptist entity, put out where they attempted to justify, I think, at least I'm putting my own interpretation on this as far as why they put these numbers out. But I think they were trying to show that the Southern Baptists and the greater evangelical world, because it was outside of just Southern Baptists, believe that Christians had a responsibility to care for illegal migrants and also supported policies to resettle refugees. And I don't think this actually jives with the, at least what I see on the ground and what some of the polling with evangelicals seems to indicate as far as their vote for Trump. Why would they vote for a candidate who has made opposite policies his primary platform? But there is some question as far as to what extent Southern Baptists in the pews and in leadership, and they call them in the Southern Baptist Convention the entities, in these entities who are running them. That's like your bureaucracy. To what extent are they social conservatives and voting on the right issues, right-wing issues like abortion and same-sex marriage and social issues that have been traditionally associated with the religious right? And to what extent are they motivated when it comes to America First policies? And I don't know the answer to that. I think we're still trying to figure that out. But I'll just give you my guess. My guess is that Southern Baptists in the pews primarily are against illegal migration. They do believe in America first. I think the polling that has tried to reflect otherwise is probably there for political reasons. And the leadership, as you, I think, just rightly stated, has been trying to ingratiate itself with who they see as powerful and who they can convince to favor them and not see them as these backwater hayseed hicks and bigots. Like they're very sensitive to that image being passed around of them. So they're trying to overcome that with the elites. And it hasn't worked. So it's just a stupid move, in my opinion. But that's where things are at right now.
So when it comes to the actual numbers, the actual involvement of the church organizations and the government, what is the level of overlap? I think that the Southern Baptist Convention is probably less egregious in this than some of the other denominations, but still active. What are they supporting? How much money are they getting from the government? What's involved in kind of this mass migration effort?
Okay, so like policy wise, what is the denomination advancing?
Yeah, what's their policy and practically on the ground with organizations, okay, what actions are they taking?
This is what my article is about. So I don't know the full extent to which the Southern Baptist Convention is participating in refugee resettlement and getting money from USAID, working with World Vision. So let's start there, and then we'll go to the policy end of it. The policy end of it is a much easier to explain. But as far as who's getting what money from the government, the thing you have to understand first about the Southern Baptist Convention is they are different than other denominations that have strong hierarchies. So we'll take the Presbyterian Church in America as a comparable denomination with similar conservative instincts, or at least they have. That's also, there's actually debates right now about that because of an issue with this segregated Black church, Black History Month dinner that was held, and one of their main leaders was there advocating it. But well, for the sake of argument, let's say the PCA and the SBC are pretty comparable here on the social issues, and they're conservative. The PCA has a much more strong ability to control what churches do. And there's a mechanism for booting churches and booting pastors, which is much more effective. It may work slowly, but they work as a denomination. If you're Roman Catholic, the PCA, you would probably recognize a little bit better. They're not quite where the Roman Catholics are, but there's a very much a top-down structure. The SBC is not like that. So the SBC has individual churches, and some will even tell you we only exist 3 days a year when we come together for convention. That's a little bit of an overstatement, but they're churches who come together to fund very specific things. It's kind of like the federal republic that we were supposed to have. Mm-hmm. We come together to fund missions. They come together to fund education for pastors, and it should be limited to that. And the people who give to the SBC think that's what they're giving to. Now, these entities that the denomination funds who have these stated purposes have, I think, veered off track. And there's been attempts to audit them to find out what's going on. Why did the North American Mission Board give so much money? I don't remember the exact figure, but to lobbying, it was an astronomical amount. What are they lobbying? What are they doing? We don't know because they always resist efforts to actually get that information. But there's also prominent Southern Baptist churches. So there's large mega churches like J.D. Greer's church in North Carolina, for example, that serve as an example to other churches within the denomination. And even though they are not in the denomination hierarchy, on paper, they function as if they're in the denominational hierarchy. So here's why I say all this. You have churches like Summit Church, which J.D. Greer runs in Raleigh, North Carolina, giving a tremendous amount of effort towards refugee resettlement. And some of this money is coming from eventually organizations like USAID. And they work with, in this particular case, Send Relief. Send Relief is an NGO. They were started after World War II by the National Association of Evangelicals as a way to give relief to Germany, to Japan. And in the 1970s, they started getting money after the Vietnam War for some refugee resettlement. And then in the 90s, USAID started giving them money. And now over half their budget is government money from the State Department, from USAID, up until recently, to resettle refugees. So they have gotten their tentacles into various churches, denominations, and other groups to help supply volunteers. J.D. Greer's church is one of those. And I did not mention this in the article because that's not technically the denomination, but there are other ways in which the denomination is receiving money directly. The example I gave, and this is, I think, the only known example at this point, I think there's probably more, is Send Relief, which is under the North American Mission Board, which is an entity of the Southern Baptist Convention, was giving grants and also receiving money from Send Relief for refugee resettlement in Boston. And the reason this is interesting is not just because of the money they're receiving, but it's also because the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, Clint Presley in North Carolina, his church was the sending church that created this plant. So it's a church plant in Boston. That's what you say when it's like a smaller church that's just getting started. But the money came from Hickory Grove Baptist Church to start this church that's receiving all this money for refugee resettlement, at least $70,000, as far as we can tell. If there's more, we don't know about it. So anyway, it is complicated, and that's why I took a long time explaining this. The SBC's decentralized format makes it a little more complicated, but they are receiving money, and we don't know exactly how much. So that's the answer to the question of where's the government money coming in for refugee resettlement, allegedly refugee resettlement. Some of these people will never get refugee status, but that's what they call it. So
yeah, and oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say I'll go on to the second part, but I need to catch my breath. I'll let you engage.
Yeah. Well, and I should just say that I have grown up in Southern Baptist churches my entire life. My father was in the military, and so we weren't stationary. However, the one thing that was always around was the Southern Baptist hymnal. So this is a denomination I've been a part of literally, since I was born. And while I'm not someone who was ever deep into church politics, knowing all the organizations and structures and these kind of things, it always was something that was home for me. Again, when we were moving, every year, the fact that was always present in our life was something that really continued and brought like a home and a family and a structure and a culture that wouldn't have otherwise existed probably if I was just constantly, being rootless and moving around every year, that kind of thing. So these organizations are very personally important to me is what I'm trying to communicate here. The decentralized nature has always been a reality, like you said, and that has its ups and its downs. That means that many churches are operating with little to no involvement in the type of things that we're talking about here. However, if organizations that influence such a large body of churches can be captured, then they're inevitably going to have a big influence. And so that's why I think it's important to recognize that even if a lot of parishioners and a lot of even churches aren't really involved in this at any meaningful level directly, if this kind of ideology is allowed to be supported inside these institutions, it really can have a huge impact on a vast swath of evangelical Christians who, like you said, are huge Trump supporters for the most part in the United States. So I think it's pretty important. But you're saying also the doctrines that had been affected or that were being affected by the church.
The policy end of it. And
Yeah.
before I get there, I just thought of something else. You know, when I was a seminary student, I've actually never shared this even on my podcast. In 2017, I went to a Southern Baptist seminary in Wake Forest, North Carolina, called Southeastern. I got wind of a situation near the seminary. And one of the reasons I haven't talked about this, and I will, because I couldn't confirm the story, and I'm going to say this, I can't confirm what I'm about to say. But the reason I'm saying it, though, is because I think it plays into what's happening now. The story is there was a church plant near the school that was doing the kind of thing we're talking about now, refugee resettlement, but it was illegal migrants that were getting finances from the church. So the church, so in other words, they would go to the church, receive money for living and, you know, for food and shelter and so forth. And this was a church plant. And since then, I have heard a lot of stories about Send and the North American Mission Board. Really, it's more like the North American Mission Board planting churches. So these are church plants that have very strong left-leaning pastors, and they incentivize this kind of thing because the Southern Baptists are essentially giving money. Traditional churches, probably like the one you grew up in, Auron, which is conservative and all the rest, but you're giving money to a denomination that says, we're using this for missions, and then they will do their missions overseas and also their missions in North America. And because it's coming from the top of the denomination, the elites get to choose who is getting the money and how it's being used. And so I just wanted to say, if you're a Southern Baptist listening to this, and people do come to me with leads and that kind of thing, you might want to look into church plants specifically. They have less accountability sometimes, depending on how they're formed. And I just hear a lot more stories. I'm not surprised in Boston that we could confirm that this was a church plant that was started that ended up getting all this money. Now, the policy end of it, there are two things going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, primarily pushing the needle left on immigration. One is when the assembly meets every year, they vote on what are called resolutions. These are non-binding, but they are symbolic of the direction of the denomination. And this is where they make moral evaluations and statements. Very famously, they boycotted Disney. Remember that?
Oh,
Back
yeah.
in the
I remember.
90s.
We couldn't go for years. Yeah.
And that wasn't a binding thing. You didn't have to not go. It was just that the Southern Baptists said, this is what we want to do as a collective effort. They rebuked Bill Clinton, right? These are the kinds of things that some people think the Southern Baptists are still doing. In reality, if you start reading the resolutions from the past 10 years, you will find there is a solid leftist trajectory, especially when it comes to matters of race and ethnicity. I think every year it's almost required, it seems like. I asked before the convention, I said, okay, which is the one on race they're going to do? Because we know they're going to do something on that. I think a lot of this started with something called the Great Commission Resurgence in 2010, where the Southern Baptists got together and said, our denomination is going to die because it's a bunch of old white guys. We need to diversify. And we need to find young people to make our denomination survive. So they started changing the way that they did ministry. Colleges started doing the diversity thing. My college, Southeastern, had the Center for Kingdom Diversity. But one of the elements of this was the refugee resettlement and the immigration and the softening of the traditional Baptist views, I would say, or most Southern Baptists, what they would view, how they would think about this issue. And so you look at resolutions from the early 2000s on immigration into up until like 2011. And when they talk about immigration in these resolutions, they are very focused on the laws must be enforced. Business, even in the 2003 resolution, businesses that hire illegal aliens should be punished. They use the word illegal alien. There's a softening that happens over time, though. And by 2018, they're talking about compassionate ways forward for policy, that the United States, they urge Congress to make legal pathways for citizenship. They're not using the term illegal anymore. And then by 2023, they're saying that the government has a responsibility to care for the migrants who come across the border, which is that's unique and novel, because before it was we should care for them, but the government needs to do their job. So the churches should be involved in this. Now the government has a shared responsibility there. So they've been pushing the needle left if you just look at these resolutions. one of the and the second part to this question, the second answer is that one of the big engines for this is an organization or an entity in the SBC called the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission. This was run by Russell Moore for many years. He's probably the most famous and the worst abuser of his office. In this respect, he's now the editor-in-chief at Christianity Today, which many might know is a left-leaning Christian publication. And he really stressed over the course of years that if the Southern Baptists were going to be pro-life, they also had to be pro-immigrant, because the immigrant is made in the image of God, just like the unborn baby. Now, of course, I think you probably, and many in your audience, spot the fallacy here that the issue of murder is much different than the issue of whether or not you let someone into your house or into your country and under what circumstances. One's a quality of life, one's an actual life issue. But he conflated these things, and he used his bully pulpit to go to places like the New York Times and the Washington Post and other platforms within the Southern Baptist Convention to berate the own members of his denomination, that they were too conservative and that they were out of step with the politics of Jesus and the politics of the gospel, and they weren't consistently pro-life. So he did this over the course of, I don't know, about 6-7 years or so in his position. And now his successor, Brent Leatherwood, is basically someone he trained and parrots the same kinds of things. So most recently, the ERLC was advocating for a bill that James Lankford, who's a Southern Baptist, put forward that basically, it was an attempt to satisfy everyone, supposedly. Democrats and Republicans could get behind this. This was last year. But the bill had within it a provision that if the border crossings were less than 21,000 a week, that the State Department could not use emergency funds to address the problem. So it was a sneaky way to try to continue the flow, in my opinion, of the migrants coming across the border. But during the Trump administration, there were a lot of symbolic overtures from Moore and from Leatherwood and from even past presidents of the convention, leaders that Southern Baptists would recognize. And they opposed Trump at every turn. They tried to say that the whole DACA situation, when Trump tried to overturn that this was wrong and immoral and out of step with our views as Christians. They tried to do the same thing when there was a moratorium on immigration from these places in the Middle East that were unvetted. They screamed about that, and they made a bunch of symbolic statements about it. And then you have the Biden administration, and they're silent. They don't say a thing about the border crisis except to support James Lankford. So that clearly the Southern Baptist Convention has gone very far left over in a very short period of time, at least on the level of their leadership in the denomination, while the voting patterns of their members seem to be stable. They're still voting Republican. They're still voting for Trump. So that's a long way of me explaining kind of where they're at now.
Yeah, you can really see Conquest's second law just absolutely sprinting away from the center on that one. So unfortunately, the Southern Baptist Convention is far from the only denomination experiencing this. Obviously, Lutherans are running a large amount of these type of operations. Catholics, we even had the American Bishop Council, I believe, sue the United States, the Trump administration, in an attempt to get their funding back, get their program back open. J.D. Vance famously talked about the Ordo Amoris. And this was like, even the Pope was like, nah, he doesn't get it. He doesn't understand. John, help me out here. You went to seminary. There's a book, there's a story about the Good Samaritan, and that means that the entire population of Africa has to move to Ohio. That's the only interpretation that seems to be available in that passage. God said you have to take care of the stranger, and so you just have to move entire continents worth of people into the United States at our expense. That's biblical, right? That's the doctrine every church has to hold.
The historic understanding of that, and I'll appeal to Charles Spurgeon here since we're talking about Baptists, and he's very revered in the Baptist world. The historical understanding is that this was a example of the Ordo Amoris, the order of loves, because the Good Samaritan was in proximity to the man on the road. He was passing by. So it's who he saw. It was who was in his everyday experience. And Charles Spurgeon says about this that the Good Samaritan figured that this man was in his neighborhood. If you were in your own neighborhood, think about it, and you started walking down the street just for a walk around the block, and you noticed someone, and they maybe weren't from your neighborhood, but they were actually struggling on the side of the road, what would you do? Well, that's your neighborhood, and that's what Charles Spurgeon says about it, and that's the historic Christian understanding of that. So it actually reinforces the idea of proximity, which is the principle here. It doesn't override natural relationships. You don't find in the story of the Good Samaritan that he's supposed to prefer someone who's foreign over his own children. It's actually a very simple story to just say, if you are coming along the road and there's someone that is in need of help and you have the resources to help that person, God put that person in his providence there for you to help. And it's about charity. It's not about what the government does either. So this has been abused in multiple ways to forward policy that takes it out of the realm of personal jurisdiction, puts it into the hands of the government, and then ignores the idea of proximity. We're giving all sorts of money to people on the other side of the world, and in some cases bringing them here, which, by the way, is a lot more expensive. It's actually easier to help them when they remain in their countries, but we're spending an enormous amount of money to bring them here and give them welfare and so forth. And the Good Samaritan story is not that doesn't reflect that at all. So I think it's an abuse of the story, and it's kind of a shame. I think it reinforces probably our views that the Ordo Amoris is actually something that applies to the people in closer proximity.
Yeah, I think it would be a different story if the Samaritan had decided to move the entirety of Syria into the city he was passing by, right? Like,
It's
that
a
would have
scale
been
thing too, right?
right. That's a pretty critical distinction of one individual who happens to be traveling in an area as opposed to relocating large amounts of people. Also, I see this one cited a lot. There's neither Jew nor Gentile, right? Like this, male and female. This has been erased. So nations are just gone, right? Like everyone is just a Christian. So you can't have nations anymore because Christians have to welcome all Christians into their country. Is that the intention there from that passage? Is that we're abolishing the existence of nations and that all Christians have to be welcomed into all nations at all times?
Yeah, it's another novel interpretation. So in Ephesians 2 talks about this barrier wall being taken down between Gentiles and Jews. It actually specifically says the wall is the law, the Old Testament ceremonial law that gives a specific Jewish identity that separates them from the Gentiles. And if you wanted to become a Jew, you had to actually keep that law, circumcision being the primary commandment. And that was abolished in Christ. In a spiritual sense, the church is an entity that unites every tongue, tribe, and nation, as we see in Revelation. But this was not supposed to apply to the temporal world as a way of making nations obsolete, or no more than it is gender. I mean, we're one in Christ as male and female, but of course that doesn't mean that males and females now don't exist. So actually, I think that people who try to use that verse are completely abusing it. And if they go to other sections of Scripture that talk about the spiritual nature of the church, they'll find, such as Revelation 6 and 7, which I just cited, they'll find that nations are a reality even into the new creation, the new world, the consummation of all things. They still exist. There's still distinctions there. So those distinctions are not erased. And I think the other thing, and you haven't brought this up, but I think it's good for me to probably talk about this as well. I hear this a lot, that in the Old Testament, the law given to Israel was supposed to be a law that applied equally to foreigners, and they were supposed to treat the foreigners well, or the strangers, sometimes they'll call them, in the land, the sojourners. And there's a few problems, I think, with people who try to also appeal to that to justify these kinds of immigration policies. The first one is a scale issue. As you rightly pointed out, the Good Samaritan isn't about more than one person, and it's on this human scale. It's not about importing the whole country into your country or something of that nature. And it's the same thing in the Old Testament. When we're talking about foreigners, we're not talking about an invasion. The ancient world would have seen what's possible now with modern technology in mass transit as an invasion. If it was the same scale, if you saw millions of people swarming into your country, you would call the military. So it's a different set of circumstances. The ancient world, they did not have, I mean, unless I guess you're talking about the Great Wall of China, there weren't, the long walls, but they did have walls around their cities and so forth. So there was security. They also had laws in the Old Testament concerning the ownership of property, that it had to remain in the hands of ethnic Jews. So in the year of Jubilee, even if someone who is a stranger would purchase land, it would revert to Jewish people because they weren't strangers, or foreigners were not allowed to have that kind of a stake in Israel. So there's a very strong in-group preference, which we do not have now. They didn't have the same welfare rules and all these kinds of things. So when it talks about the law being applied equally, it just means that things like murder and rape and these crimes that are punishable, they would be punishable you would punish someone who's Jewish, you would punish someone who's foreign. They would both be punishable, but it didn't mean, foreigners were prevented from becoming kings. They couldn't have political leadership. Foreigners could be perpetual slaves and native Israelites could not. So there's all these privileges that foreigners did not enjoy. Our situation is much different. We're bringing these people in and we're immediately giving them every kind of privilege that comes with citizenship, which was fought by our fathers and forefathers, that was gained through much sacrifice. And now we're bankrupting our system. So I just think that Christians who try to appeal to these things are making some basic errors.
Yeah, this is something that I didn't quite grasp, when I was young, listening to these stories. Of course, you're right that, the constant waves of immigration would have been rightly understood as invasion. In fact, the Roman Empire had to fight several wars to prevent large-scale immigration into its borders. It's not that people even wanted to conquer Rome. It's just that they wanted to be a part of it, and the Romans had to fight them off because they knew that their republic could not continue if they allowed a large number of foreigners in and let them join in and hold power. Italy had to go to war to get Roman citizenship, for crying out loud. Forget all of the other outlying provinces. But also a really critical thing that I didn't get when I read the stories in the Old Testament about not consuming the sacrifices to other gods, and I didn't recognize until I read the Ancient City from Collage that practice was one of joining into the identity of the nation, that the shared meals of sacrificed meat to the gods was actually the initiation ritual of spiritual joining into the city, into the population. And so those distinctions in the Old Testament are critical. They're not just, oh, well, this was, sacrificed to an idol and we only believe in Jehovah, so you can't do that. It was an additional layer of, no, that would mean you would join another nation, you would be of another people. And the distinction between nation and state was still rather relevant at that time. Today, we just kind of fold them into the same thing. Country and nation are the same thing, but they're not at all. And this is recognized through most of history until now. And so when people come and as soon as they get, an EBT card and a social security number, they're American. They're right. Like, this is the idea because they happen to fall now under the operations of the state, the government, the country. But that doesn't mean they've joined the nation, and it never did in any serious sense throughout history. And that disconnect, I think, is very difficult, especially for Christians who have not, like myself, until just a few years ago, really understood the historical context of nationhood.
Yeah, that's a really, really great point. And if you read, I think it's Isaiah. I can't remember if it's Isaiah or Ezekiel. I think it's Isaiah. The prophet says that the northern, if you remember from biblical history, and some people may not know this, so I'll just explain. The northern tribes of Israel were separated from the southern tribes of Israel over really who was going to be king and what direction the nation would go. And then they were both in captivity at different points, and they had a different series of kings. And that's what First and Second Kings is about, and First and Second Chronicles. So during that time, the northern tribes ended up being, to make this simple, they ended up mixing in with the Assyrians. And because of that mixing, and that was intermarriage, that was some of this was, I think, policy, because empires in the ancient world, if they wanted to destabilize you, they could just take captive your people, import them. This is what the story of Daniel's about, right? In the Babylonian Empire, import them into their country and replace you with people from their country. And that's how they take your land. I mean, very smart. And so this happened to the 10 tribes. They mix in with Assyrians and other groups. And part of the mixing is they start worshiping their gods and so forth. And Isaiah says that they ceased to exist, that they were no longer a nation. Now, if you go fast forward to Jesus's time, the story of the Good Samaritan, the woman at the well, when he goes into Samaria and talks to this woman at the well, and the disciples are like, why would you talk to her? Because she's a Samaritan. He's talking to a descendant of those people. And they were allies with the Romans against Israel. So through this intermixing, they end up creating a new people that is now hostile to the southern tribes that remained as Israel and continued. So this is a warning you see throughout Scripture not to do this. The Samaritans are a bad example. Don't be like them. Solomon is, of course, the poster child for compromise, because he married all these foreign women, and then he allowed them to have their idols, and they turned his heart away. And that's, of course, viewed rightly as a spiritual compromise. But as you say, there are cultural components to this, and it's the loss of identity. That's also a big part of it. And so there's, it's politically incorrect to say now, but a number of the minor prophets warn against intermarriage with foreign peoples for this very reason. And the people who like to appeal to the Old Testament for their immigration policies that are leftist do not want to bring up those laws for obvious reasons.
Yeah, I mean, these are practices that still exist inside Orthodox Jewish communities today, right? There's a high level of intermarriage there because they want to keep the nation alive. That's what was necessary for many thousands of years when you're trying to keep a diaspora community together throughout being stateless and these kind of things. And so it's understood that even though they had no state, they were a nation in a very real sense, because they understood the need to kind of perpetuate that. But back to kind of the operations on the ground, refugee gets you a lot, right? Like that's the language in Europe as well. If you go everywhere, it's the refugee crisis. It's refugees. Even though the vast majority of these people are not fleeing violence, they're not under threat, they're not being ethnically cleansed or anything in their home countries. They just want money, and I get it. If I was starving in a third world nation and I had the opportunity to flee to the United States and make a better life for my family, I would absolutely do it. I 100% understand the incentive structure and everything else about it. That said, the United States can't say the United States if the people in the United States aren't from the United States. And so if you continually encourage every single person who wants a better life for their family to come to the United States, you won't have that better life, because the United States is what it is, not because it just happens to be sitting on magic soil, but because the people here matter and they made a country that matters. And so the word refugee seems to be like this silver bullet that gets around people's understanding of this. This guy must be fleeing political persecution somewhere, or his entire family is going to get put up against a wall if they don't get out of the country tomorrow. When in fact it's usually just single guys moving to the U.S. hoping to, or Europe trying to get onto the welfare state there. And so I wonder, do you feel like a lot of these organizations are just confused by kind of a bad exegesis and the word refugee, or is it the financial incentives? Is it malicious? What is driving this?
Well, yeah, I think you actually have a very shrewd point there, because when I was writing the article and it goes through an editing process, and the editors at the Federalist wanted to know why I use the term refugee so much, and could you use a different word? And the problem was that's the word the Southern Baptists are using. So I'm like, if I'm quoting them, they understood you have to use the term refugee. So I just put in a little sentence that we understand many of these people will not actually receive refugee status, but they're called refugees from a very early stage. And this is where this is kind of the boomer con, like, I just don't want illegal immigration, right? Legal immigration's fine, but here's the problem. The lines are so blurred between those two things at this point. We actually don't know, who is in this country that applies for refugee status that will actually attain that status. And they're here with a distant court date, waiting for the time, and maybe not even waiting. They've just diffused into the culture at this point. They've jumped the ship, and you're not going to find them. Maybe ICE will find them now, but I mean, this is kind of the problem. Is this was being used as a pretext for illegal migration. So I don't know the percentage of people helped by Send or World Relief who were actually ultimately just illegal migrants that were getting welfare and all the rest, and who actually have a valid claim for refugee status because of the way our system is. You are allowed to stay in the country while you're waiting for the courts to hear your case. And then it depends on what the judge says. And I remember when I was in Los Angeles last year, and people in my area, I'm in upstate New York right now, have told me they don't believe that this is actually happening, that no illegal migrant gets Social Security. But I was actually in Los Angeles on the street in Van Nuys, California, so right outside of LA. And I looked up, and there was a billboard on a very busy street, and it had a picture of a Social Security card. And it was in Spanish, so I couldn't read it. So I took a picture and did the Google Translate. And the translation said, "We'll get you the documents, even the ones that are hard to get." And it was a law firm. Who is that for? Obviously, it is for illegal migrants. And everyone in the area knows that's exactly what's going on. That these are people who, under normal circumstances, could not attain and could not get these documents. And somehow lawyers are getting them to them. So I think there's so many working moral issues here, but I think ultimately this is robbery. This is taking from those who have sacrificed much for their children, and society is the relationship between the past, the dead, and those who are yet to come, the living. And it's taking from them, and it's giving to those who are not part of that story. And if we choose to do that kind of thing, that's one thing. But to do this in the manner in which they've done it through bureaucracy, without people actually weighing in, is very unjust and very wrong, and it amounts to stealing.
Yeah, and that's what really hurts my heart so much, because I've been in these scenarios where it's like, okay, let's go pack a bunch of food for, people who are coming across the border, and it's nothing but people with the best hearts in the church thinking, oh, well, we're helping someone, right? But ultimately, they don't really want to be involved in bringing a large amount of illegal aliens into the United States. And, speaking again about kind of the Ordo Amoris, I used to be a public school teacher. I would sit in classrooms, Christmas time would come, 80% of my classroom was, immigrants from Haiti or Central America. And I would ask them, hey, let's do a quiz about Christmas. And they would just know nothing about Christ. They would know nothing about the Christmas story. They would know, we're told all the time, oh, these are Christian countries, it's Christian populations coming in. But they would be completely ignorant of what was going on there. And, at the very least, if you're dedicated to reaching people for Christ, could you at least reach the immigrants that are in your hometown at this point? The United States is wildly unchurched, so maybe we could reach some Americans for Christ instead of just automatically sending all of our money overseas to reach people who we don't even see. But also, what about, the immigrants you have already brought here who are wildly also unchurched and unfamiliar with what's going on? It just, again, I understand that the Great Commission is to reach all nations, but maybe you should reach the people in your own nation first before you send all of your money and missionaries to other nations and encourage all the people there to come in and still have them not churched, I guess. Maybe I'm crazy here, but I feel like that's just the wrong order of operations.
There are two strategies they seem opposite, but they have been employed by prominent Southern Baptists to convince the masses in their denomination to support these policies. And one of them is that, and I heard this all the time when I was in seminary, the nations are coming here. This is a good thing. And so policies that bring people who are not Christians to the United States are good because then they can be exposed to the gospel. And somehow this is in tandem with, we're also sending our money overseas. That's not changing. So we're also going to go over there. But they're coming here. So this is a great opportunity for the gospel. And that's the only thing you should think about is the religious opportunity. And you're kind of guilty if you start saying, well, wait, what is this going to do to my town, my community, my country? You're a bigot if you say that, because you're denying or rejecting this great opportunity that exists before you. So that's one of the things that has been used. The other thing that's been used, though, is to give the impression that there are a very high percentage of Christians in these migrant populations. And there's two ways I've seen this. One is because many of the Latin American countries have people who are Roman Catholic. At least they say that. Now, you have to understand, Roman Catholics in these Latin American countries are much different than Roman Catholics coming from Europe. In their voting patterns are even different.
Right.
And so, but they'll just sort of like make a blank statement. I know Lincoln Duncan, who's in the PCA, did this a few years ago, this like almost tear-filled rant about how this is going to be great because it's going to replace all the Richard Dawkins and the white, WASP skeptics of Christianity are going to be replaced by these great Roman Catholics who align with us more socially. And they'll use they'll use a poster child or a model migrant for this. And one of them, I'm going to name him. I might get in trouble for this, but who cares? Jose Ocampo. Jose Ocampo is a worship and student discipleship associate. I assume that means a pastor of some kind, or maybe just someone who works under a pastor at Hickory Grove Baptist Church. And the reason I bring his name up is because Hickory Grove Baptist Church is where Clint Presley, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention, pastors. In 2017, when we were having this debate over the Dreamers, the Southern Baptist Convention, and at least certain entities like Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary and the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, decided to go pretty hard in lobbying. So Southern Baptist money was used to pay for lobbyists in DC to pressure Congress to support the Dreamers and the Dream Act. And so when this was going on, Jose Ocampo was one of the guys who went on radio shows and was kind of publicly out there as, I'm a dreamer. And if you don't support this policy, I have to go home. And so Clint Presley, the president now of the Southern Baptist Convention, even went out there and did a whole video saying that, this guy's a Christian. And you're sending a brother in Christ to a country that he was not as familiar with as the one that he's primarily grown up in, the United States. And he's just doing so many great things for our church and on staff. And so that's what you're doing. And it's kind of resembles the Social Security defense of you're killing grandma, right?
Right.
And that's what they've run these kinds of plays. And it's ironic that Clint Presley's been pretty quiet lately on the whole refugee resettlement issue, when he was pretty loud in 2017. But Jose's still working at his church. So this is the play that they run, that the people coming, if they're not Christian, you should feel guilty about supporting policies to prevent them from coming because they need to hear the gospel. And if they are Christian, you should see that as a positive because it's going to actually form a culture and society that is more in keeping with Christian values.
Last thing I want to ask you before we go to the questions of the people. I just got back from Jordan Peterson's ARC conference in London. The good news is that I think we finally got kind of the rational centrist types to the point where they're like, Christianity, yeah, I guess that's kind of important. Like they're like, yeah, I guess those Western values came from somewhere. Were just materialized by the Declaration of Independence or something, but they have roots in a particular tradition and a particular understanding of the world, a religion, these kind of things. And so there was a lot of talk about Christianity in the cultural sense, right? Like even if everyone involved wasn't a personal believer, they recognized the centrality of Christianity as kind of like a foundation for what was Christendom. And for some reason we keep calling the West when we mean Christendom. And so that was positive, right? That's a good step.
Good.
However, there was a bad step as well, which was whenever someone attempted to say, okay, but we're moving a large amount of, say, Muslims into Europe. And if we're going to be a Christian culture, wouldn't we need to like prefer Christianity? Wouldn't there need to be some way that we promote Christianity? Isn't it insufficient to just say we're Christian, but then move all of the most rabid fanatics of a different religion into the country and expect Christianity to thrive? And the answer was uniformly, well, no, of course not. Like, we're not going to be a Christian civilization. It's going to be pluralism. It's going to be tolerance. It's going to be, we got to figure out how to, we'll win in the marketplace of ideas or something. And so I guess my question here is there seems to be a gap now where our technocratic secular ruling class that hasn't gone completely woke has finally recognized that Christianity is kind of your only other option to either wokeness or militant Islam. It turns out you need a religion of some kind. However, when they start to discuss our Christian values, they seem to not believe you actually need to be Christian to have them. And I think this becomes incredibly important, again, when we're importing a large amount of people from foreign countries who are unchurched, are not particularly Christian, even though, like you said, they might be, Catholic in the loosest sense possible. And so you're really, even though, again, like you said, we're going to get rid of the Dawkins and we're going to bring all these Christian people, that just turns out not to be the case, right? And so what do you think will happen with that? Do you ultimately see kind of a lot of these secular government forces that are trying to kind of give lip service to Christian values? Are they going to tie that together? Are they going to understand that you can't just import X number of people? Like, you actually have to have people who care, and Christianity matters. You have to prefer it. This has to be something that if our government is not, obviously we're not like establishing the state church, but our government understands like this is the preference we should have in the United States. I mean, what do you think about that?
So yeah, if I could plug this, because I write about this, I have a book that is coming out actually this week. You might even be able to get it on Amazon now, called Against the Waves, Christian Order in a Liberal Age. Jon Harris. Go to Amazon, or you can go to my website. It should be up later today at johnharrispodcast.com, and I have autographed copies there. But anyway, what one of the things that I get into in the book is I try to predict what is going to happen with the new enthusiasm I see among tech elites. So Elon Musk is one. Political conservatives like Tucker Carlson. I just saw Tim Allen is reading the Bible. I mean, this is just like every day there's someone else I'm hearing about who's a celebrity or someone of influence who is curious about the Bible or Christianity, and they see it as important, as you said. And I think some of them are converting. Russell Brand, obviously, Nayla Ray, who was a pornographic actress who just had a high-profile conversion last year to Christianity. There's been a few others who have either converted to Catholicism or Protestantism of various, types. And I think that as the pressure mounts, which it will, it is going to be more and more clear that it's either going to be Christianity or Islam, or Christianity or some kind of horrific dystopian state. And you can choose. The halfway point, and where we are right now, is that these tech guys, many of them, Elon Musk included, and other, comedians, and I'm trying to think of names, and I don't know why it's escaping me. Like Bill Maher and stuff has even said things like, Richard Dawkins himself was like,
he said he's a cultural Christian, right? Yeah. Guys like Douglas Murray and Jordan Peterson and Ion Hersey Ali.
What they're doing is, I think they're some of these guys are looking at the Christianity, and they're saying, I have a better deal with those people than I do with Islam, especially like someone who's homosexual or wants to protect homosexuals, right? They're like, well, Christians are a little more lenient on this. But the problem is they're looking for a basis for their liberal values. And I think that liberalism is still their primary religious default, but they realize you can't actually ground liberalism. So you look for a religion to do it with, because secularism won't do it. So Christianity becomes the only game in town. But I think as the pressure mounts, they're going to realize that can't happen. They're going to actually have to choose. So I am optimistic that moving forward, we may have a lot of turmoil over this, but I think people will come to Christianity more and more. And I think the cool thing about it is a lot of the high profile conversions and interest that's been sparked by Christianity. Think of like the Wes Huff situation, even. These weren't from the Southern Baptist Convention. These guys aren't getting saved and evangelized because the Presbyterian Church in America or some big Christian conference or the Super Bowl ad that I forget the name of those, but he cares, Jesus cares, ads, whatever they call those. It's not those things that are actually making the difference. It's people realizing that the high school down the street is transing kids, and that can't be good, and that's making the difference. And so God takes credit for this. I think God is doing something where none of the institutions can take credit for any kind of Christianization, which is kind of cool. It only goes back to God and his glory in that scenario.
Absolutely. All right. Well, we're going to head over to the questions of the people. But before we do, John, you got a new book coming out. Is there anything else people need to know?
No, I think I said so. The website, you go to Amazon or you get an autographed copy at johnharrispodcast.com. That should be up. I'll make sure it's up within the hour.
Well, glad I could be the first stop on the book tour. I didn't even
You
know.
are. I haven't even seen my audience. I just saw that it's printed now. So
there you go. All right. Well, let's get the questions here real quick, everybody. Enrico Palazzo says, I represent Al Mohler. We must ask you now to stop the stream or face potential legal consequences. Thank you for your understanding. Actually, Mr. Mohler follows me on Twitter, so if he wanted to let me know, he could just shoot me the DM there. But has he taken any stance on this? Does he have a track record on any of these issues that is significant?
Well, what I'm about to say is not the viewpoint of Auron MacIntyre. So I hope Al Mohler follows you and you guys become friends. But my opinion is Al Mohler is a political animal who will go with the wind and whatever's opportunistic. So he has a long history of trafficking in wokeness, hiring woke people, supporting critical race theory, and then turning around and saying that he disagrees with critical race theory. And so with the immigration thing, I am not 100% sure, but I do think, yes, I believe he did sign some of like the first term Trump stuff, if I'm not mistaken, some of the statements against Trump policies, but I don't know if his record on specifically immigration.
Yeah, he had a debate with Doug Wilson at NatCon on the issue of Christian nationalism, and it really was less of a debate and more him agreeing with Doug on a good chunk of the whole thing. He used the word ontology a lot, but ultimately it seemed to be at least signaling in the direction of we do need a Christian culture, we do need Christian institutions. So I hope ultimately that is shifting. Like you said, maybe he's taken different positions over the years. I once again will speak to my ignorance when it comes to church politics and the record on a lot of these guys. But I hope that was reflective of perhaps a shift in general of kind of where they're going, because it did seem like he was more in agreement with Doug Wilson than he was speaking out against him. Treadle says something sojourner, stranger, etc. We have to figure this out in the church. It's past due. Many such issues, I guess. Yeah, and I guess we kind of already discussed this, but ultimately, the fact that this has been pushed so heavily as the church is the destruction of nations. I just hear this from so many people, and it's used as often by kind of pagans and people who want to oppose Christianity as it is by kind of the woke Christians themselves. I see also, unfortunately, a number of people who consider themselves on the right who are Christian, but don't seem to grasp the basic biblical understanding of what a nation is. They have this wildly modern, kind of post-Enlightenment understanding of nationhood that has very little to do with any ancient wisdom or Christianity. And I think there just has to be a serious effort by Christian teachers to kind of reintroduce the concept of nationhood. Again, it shouldn't be a central doctrine. It's not the most important thing in the world, when it comes to sharing Christ. But since it seems like we're going to be informing our kind of political organization by this doctrine, we should at the very least understand it and what it actually means, what the Bible really says about it, rather than have it kind of completely chopped up and thrown around and tossed into a modern blender and spewed out the other side by kind of the current wave of civic nationalism, because it's just inaccurate. It just has very little bearing on what the Bible actually says about the truth of nationhood.
Yeah, amen. I actually have a chapter, What is a Nation, in the book, and it's just Bible verse after Bible verse. So people can use that if they find it useful.
Yep, and I hope I hope many more do, because I think that's really important in the future here. All right, guys. Well, you should certainly be checking out Jon's work, his new book, his podcast, everything else. If it's your first time on this channel, you need to subscribe, click the bell, notifications, all that stuff. If you would like to catch these streams when they go live, if you want to get the broadcast as podcasts, then you need to go to your favorite podcast platform and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show. And if you'd like to get my book, The Total State, of course, it's still out there on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, all of that. If you'd like to support the show, there is merch over at The Blaze. You just go to shop@blazemedia.com and click on the Auron MacIntyre Show, and you can pick up something there. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.